This morning, we put the spotlight on human rights violations and the lack of women candidates in the country's elections. Joining me for this discussion is the Executive Director of Women in Politics Support Unit, Sakhile Sifelani-Ngoma, who is having connection problems at the moment, and we're also joined by the Director of the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, Roselyn Hanzi. Ms. Hanzi, thank you very much for your time. We're going to kick it off with you while we hope that Sakhile joins in the course of the discussion. Let's kick off the conversation about the recent developments there. The court in Zimbabwe upholding the decision that the CCC should not continue with a planned election rally. Is it your view that the courts in Zimbabwe are no longer perhaps independent of the government of the day in terms of their decision-making?
Thank you for this invitation. I also just wanted to clarify that in terms of this recent decision, the court that we are referring to right now is the lower court, which is the magistrates court, which ordinarily in terms of the law is supposed to be hearing any appeals when rallies or protests or any gatherings, particularly for political parties, are banned. So in this case, there was a case that was taken to the High Court, which directed that the magistrates court hears this appeal within a certain time frame.
Yeah.
After the political party had failed to seek audience and get the required hearing from the magistrates court as required. So as you can see, we are dealing with two very different courts and two very different decisions. I would say that possibly if there was an appeal that could have been filed at the High Court, then things could have been different. So it definitely depends on the court that you approach and also on the context and the environment. We have tended to find that sometimes when we don't get favorable decisions from the magistrates court, we do get better decisions from the High Court.
All right.
But I should say we have concerns around the independence of the courts generally.
Well, that was actually going to be my final question on this matter as to the independence of the judicial system in Zimbabwe. Are you still confident around its independence?
Well, we continue to push for reforms. Definitely where we have seen that the judiciary has been compromised, we have taken action through protest as lawyers, as we did in 2019, where we petition the Chief Justice or any other stakeholders to say we are concerned that we feel that the judiciary is being compromised. So we have been taking action to express our discontent as lawyers where we feel that the independence of the courts has been compromised.
Yeah.
And we are continuing to push that they comply with the constitutional provisions on independence of the courts. We have already raised objections around the amendment of the Constitution twice, which has led to compromising of the independence of the courts.
All right, let's bring into the conversation the Director of Women in Politics Support Unit. That's Sakhile Sifelani-Ngoma, who also joins us from Harare, but talking to us on the line because of those connection issues. Sakhile, good morning to you. I don't know if you were able to hear at least part of the conversation with Roselyn, and we kicked off this conversation about whether or not the judiciary in Zimbabwe is independent of the government of the day. I'd like you to weigh in on that particular point.
So the independence of the judiciary, I think, is probably in public perception compromised by the fact that, you know, our judiciary seems to be responsive to the temperature of the season. And the current, there's been quite a few cases that have been put before the court regarding some of the anomalies or the challenges that candidates faced, particularly around nomination court that was held on the 24th. And, you know, in terms of this election, it will be quite interesting to see how the judiciary decides, so that you can begin to turn around that perception that they are compromised. And I think it's important for the judiciary to come through, particularly around the constitutional challenges be able to uphold the constitution so that we have the protection of rights right round, not just on the electoral season, but right round the calendar year.
Yeah, and can I just continue with you for a moment, Sakhile, because the reason, I suppose, why this question is important is that here in South Africa, we often refer to the judiciary as the last line of defense, particularly of the democratic system. If you are concerned already about the independence of the judiciary in your country, who then do you look to as the last line of defending democracy in Zimbabwe?
I think it's about the citizens. It's us as citizens. I think it's important to improve the culture of constitutionalism within our country, and to start by being able to understand what does the Constitution expect of us. And the Constitution binds us not just as citizens, but it binds institutions, it binds duty bearers, and it binds some of our critical processes. And I think, my colleague earlier spoke about, the challenges that they've raised regarding the amendment of the Constitution. But when it comes down to, perhaps the electoral season that we're currently in, I think it's important to be able to talk about political accountability. How do we begin to have political party culture and political party systems that also conduct themselves in a way that upholds the Constitution and indeed promotes the Constitution? So, that's what we'll be looking for, because at the end of the day, if you have a political party that has 2/3 majority in Parliament, they have the capacity, and they certainly have the power to do so, but whether you should do so is to change the Constitution is another matter altogether. And so I think it's important to be able to strengthen our capacity as citizens to have political accountability, and it requires legal intervention as well. If you look at some of the challenges we have around our political parties, is that we have an electoral system that is both in the Constitution and in our electoral laws that could be strengthened, and hence there has been a lot of talk in the past 5 years about the need for electoral law reform. And we haven't delivered on substantive law reform that could perhaps reduce some of the challenges that we are facing.
Roselyn, let's bring you back into the conversation. Let's then go deeper and talk about the participation of women in politics in Zimbabwe. What would your assessment be?
Well, generally, I would say that the participation of women has been very low. And as we can see, following the nomination that occurred last month, we do not even have any female candidates for the presidential position. So our main concern has been around the legal framework, but also the lack of constitutionalism in the country generally, but also the lack of political party democracy. We do not see the political parties fielding adequate female candidates. We continue to see that patriarchy is prevailing in the political parties. But we also see that the necessary laws that were supposed to be introduced to ensure that there are some seats that are reserved for women were not reformed in time. The Constitution says that if there are any laws that apply to an election that needs to be introduced, this has to be done 3 months before the election. And we started talking about aligning the Electoral Act to the Constitution, which generally speaks around gender equality and ensuring that there is 50-50 representation in the political parties and in the administration, eventually when the elections are actually conducted. But this has not been done. Yeah. So we do have a big gap in terms of participation of females.
As Women in Politics Support Unit, Sakhile, what are your reasons, based on your considered view, your assessment of the situation in Zimbabwe? Why is it, if indeed you agree with Roselyn, that the participation of women in politics is becoming less and less in Zimbabwe?
I think the first one to call out, really, I think we do have to talk about how our political parties are not inclusive of gender equality. And it's a difficult one to state, but that's what the data shows us. We don't have a fielding pattern by political parties that seem to promote or seek to adhere to the constitutional thresholds. And so if we don't have political parties putting forward and actively promoting women as part and parcel of their leadership, it is then limits what is going to be available on the electoral menu. So when we get to the ballot, if you look at this particular election that we're headed towards, 151 constituency seats are going to be contested by male-only candidates. That's deeply problematic. It points not just to, it's not about women, whether women are willing to be candidates or not. It talks about the political will sitting in our political parties that doesn't seem to take women seriously as part of the leadership culture in the country. The second one I think we have to talk about is the legal barrier that was created by the introduction of the nomination fee. For the first time we see an increase, a phenomenal increase of nomination fees for members of parliament, $1,000. I mean, that is a phenomenal amount of money by any standing. And if you look at the presidential candidates, $20,000 to contest as a presidential candidate. These things don't enhance participation; they reduce the participatory field. And I think these are quite problematic.
Yeah, Roselyn, how much of a difference would it make in the Zimbabwe political culture if there was an infusion of more women in politics and therefore introducing laws that will make life better for Zimbabweans? Do you think it will make a huge difference?
Well, I would think that it would make a huge difference, given the fact that if you look at the demographics in the last census report of the country, women are the majority of the population. And we have also seen generally where women are heading institutions, those institutions are doing very well. I'll give an example of the Auditor General that we had, who was female, who is just left office. She was producing very comprehensive reports that you could see were being done by a professional who was very independent. We have seen women who have done very well leading some of the government institutions in the country, and also generally in the other sectors, we see women who are leading. And generally we feel that as women, we are more tolerant, and women are more accommodating than men. If we had more women participating in elections, we would not have many incidences of political violence. We have seen women as victims of political violence, and we've also seen women being used as instruments of political violence because of the economic situation and the system of patronage that is generally existing in the country. So I do believe that with more women, we would have more peaceful elections and possibly better leadership in the country.
Sakhile, how are women used as instruments of violence in the political culture that exists there now?
I think we have a political culture, unfortunately, that, first of all, just in terms of representation, it's a culture that promotes men, because we have an over-representation of men if you look at our data. But it also then promotes masculinities and perhaps then toxic masculinities as forms of leadership. But I think as a country that's over 43 years post-independence, I think we can begin to say that the Zimbabwe that we have, and certainly the Zimbabwe that was articulated in the 2013 Constitution, is a Zimbabwe where both men and women, actively not just participate or contribute, but also lead. And I think when we speak about the political culture that we have, I think the political arena is critical in terms of providing leadership. It is the advanced sector in our society that says, this is the direction in which we are going. So it becomes quite critical for our political parties to demonstrate that that inclusivity, that support, that active support and demonstrable measurement of women in leadership by fielding women and supporting women in significant leadership positions. Because if you look at our voting patterns historically, at least for the past 4 voting cycles, citizens in Zimbabwe vote essentially for their political parties, even though we do not have a broad-based proportional representation electoral system, which means that if political parties put forward women for leadership, we will vote for that woman because she's sponsored by the party that, whoever is voting particularly prefers. So it's incumbent upon our political parties to lead the way. And this can begin to shift our society in terms of looking at the private sector, looking at, our public, our parastatals, to begin to say, the leadership of women is an acceptable part of our society. But not only is it acceptable, it is essential, it is critical, and it is who we are. Because I think the numbers as they come out, this is not who Zimbabweans are, but certainly we have something very skewed in this area.
Roselyn, let's wrap it up then. Based on the discussion we have had, I've got to ask the question about how optimistic are you that the upcoming elections next month are going to produce not only an election environment that is free of violence, and perhaps that could be too strong a word, free of violence, but also a credible outcome, most importantly, a credible election outcome?
Well, as things stand at the moment, we are, and I'm seriously concerned too as a citizen who's going to be voting around the existing electoral environment. We have had challenges, for instance, with candidates accessing the voters' roll, which was only provided a few days ago by the Electoral Commission. But also we have challenges around leaders of the political party actually going around and ensuring that they pass on the message of peace. We have not seen that happening. So until we see that happening, the leaders actually walking the talk and encouraging peaceful coexistence, then for now I remain concerned that we may not have free and fair elections. Also considering that we have not had the electoral law reforms that we have been advocating for. And we have also had new laws that are being introduced to stifle civic space and other rights such as freedom of expression. A few days ago, the provisions on patriotism were passed by Parliament, and they are still waiting for the President to sign them into law. And basically the net effect of this law is to prevent people from freely speaking out, as if they speak out against the current government or the ruling party, they may actually be deemed to be willfully affecting the national interest of the country, considering that the provisions are very vague. So we are concerned around the legal environment, the laws that are being introduced, and generally the lack of will by the political parties and also the election management body to uphold provisions in the constitution around free and fair elections.
Roselyn Hanzi, let me thank you very much for your contribution to this discussion. She is with the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. Also joining us on the line is the Executive Director of Women in Politics Support Unit, Sakhile Sifelani-Ngoma. Thanks indeed for your contribution as well.